A reading from Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through 43. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell down at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come, lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus, and came behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside, and took the child's father and mother, and those who were with him, and went in to where the child was. He took her by the hand, and said to her, "Telakum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up, began to walk around. She was 12 years of age, and they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. We like these kind of stories when we let them stand as weird, abstract hang-ups from 2,000 years ago that we definitely never worry about. In 2012, I attended an academic conference on religion and HIV and AIDS at St. Paul's University in Limuru, Kenya. I played the role of dutifully listened graduate student in a room full of titans. One presentation still stands out in my mind. A pastor from South Africa spoke at length about his work as an HIV-positive religious leader and what it took to be so public about having the disease and maintain his standing in a faith community. His larger argument in that presentation, and his work as an activist, focused on driving down the stigma that people faced for being HIV positive. Even 4 decades into the pandemic, HIV still confers an aura of sexual impropriety, despite the fact that a huge percentage of new HIV infections, at this point in history, come via maternal-to-child transmission or from an uninfected spouse getting HIV from their HIV-positive spouse within the bounds of their marriage. Churches and religious leaders hold a lot of blame for establishing and perpetuating the stigma, and if the church wants to play a more positive role in helping people with HIV and AIDS, the church needs to do some repenting. Stigmatization kills people because rejection and the life of a social outcast takes some of the joy out of living. In the case of HIV and AIDS, the lack of motivation to live means a lack of motivation to take the medicines that keep the disease repressed. Our research showed that positive interactions with church led folks to take their meds and live longer. However, as an HIV-positive person, to have such an interaction, they would have to trust that they would not be judged, rejected, and put down because a virus had set up shop in their immune system. As a result of that lecture, at some point during my work in a small rural Kenyan village, I held a worship service specifically for the folks that came to our village's clinic to get their HIV meds. I have no memory of what I said to them, and it was probably terrible. Knowing that era of myself well, I probably preached on Romans 8, that nothing can separate you from the love of God, including HIV. that God doesn't reject you for having a disease. If I could go back now, 12 years later, and undo some of my early crimes against preaching, I would use these two healing miracles in Mark 5, because they give a much more concrete version of God loving across stigmatized social barriers. Leviticus 15:25 through 27 declares, "If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, not at the time of her impurity, or if she has a discharge beyond the time of her impurity, for all the days of the discharge she shall continue in uncleanliness, as in the days of her impurity. She shall be unclean. Every bed on which she lies during all the days of her discharge shall be treated as the bed of her impurity, and everything on which she sits shall be unclean, as in the uncleanliness of her impurity. Whoever touches these things shall be unclean, and shall wash his clothes, and bathe in water, and be unclean until the evening." Numbers 19:14 states, "This is the law when someone dies in a tent. Everyone who comes in the tent, and everyone who is in the tent, shall be unclean for 7 days." Both of Christ's interactions impart uncleanliness. The woman with the 12-year-long hemorrhage touches him, and he enters the house, the dead girl. One can understand the purity laws as a way of honoring God by establishing some very early public health and sanitation rules. However, by Jesus' time, as we've seen again and again, following important protections had swollen to an utter rejection of anything that doesn't fit within the precise letter of the law. Christ appears unencumbered by such concerns. When Jesus calls out, wondering who touched him, the formerly bleeding woman falls down at his feet trembling. In that moment, she seems to fear the rebuke for passing on her uncleanliness. Instead, Jesus celebrates her faith, as it says in Mark 5:34. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." The crowd gives the father of the dead girl trouble for roping Jesus into the situation, as it says in verse 35. While he was still speaking, some of the people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? Why bother passing on any additional uncleanliness? Because she died already." Jesus walks right in and brings her back to life. In 21st century America, we largely don't share these specific concerns. We often put the dead on display at their own funerals, and our understanding of women's ability to participate in society has blessedly changed. However, as my example from Kenya illustrates, we simply moved on to different things that impart stigma or uncleanliness. Our pain at seeing a loved one with dementia often keeps us away, depriving them of life-sustaining human contact. We express profound annoyance and attempt to cordon off unruly children or folks on the autism spectrum that don't conform to normal standards of behavior, often cutting them and their families off from the joy of community. In 1969, Mr. Rogers made waves by airing a scene of him sharing a small wading pool with Officer Clemens, an African-American police officer. This pushed back against the long-standing racist assumption that African Americans were more likely to spread disease, and thus the races should not share pools. Now, what do you think Jesus would do in these situations? Declaring someone unclean, imparting stigma, particularly for a condition beyond their control, often makes them suffer twice. They suffer from the thing that hurts them, and they suffer rejection and isolation, a profound pain for an innately social creature. In each of the two miracles, Jesus restores their bodies and brings them and their families back into the social fold. We reject stigma, care not for our own social purity, and seek to bring everyone away from the margins and back into beloved community. We stop developing new, weird hang-ups and never let them stop us from welcoming people.